So let's talk about your introduction. Just the mechanics, the basic structure, and more specifically, why your introductions are so terrible. And maybe they're not. They probably are. Here's the thing about introductions is we need to start with what is the point of them? Because remember, as always, everything about writing is function based. It's not there just for some magical reason. We need to look at what is it that you want out of it? Why do we even have an introduction in our paper? The main things that its job is to do is first to transition you, to get you away from where your headspace was and to get you thinking about what you want your reader thinking about. To focus you in on that and then to want you to know more. Ultimately, that's it. Your job in the introduction is to get your reader to want to know what's coming next and to want to know the answer to the question that you state explicitly or implicitly in that beginning. You're trying to get the beginning of your papers to switch from an introduction that communicates to the scorer or instructor for an academic essay of a headspace of I have to read this to I want to read this. Because this seems like a small thing, it's not. Because that headspace, when it starts badly and the scorer is thinking, oh geez, here we go. And this isn't fair, this isn't right, but this is human nature. They're now looking for a reason that your paper's bad, and they're probably going to find it. But if the introduction is effective and engaging now, and they're thinking, I want to read this, they're looking for reasons it's good, and they're probably going to find it. Here's why most introductions are terrible. The most common thing, you wrote it first. You wrote it before you did the paper. And on one hand, this seems totally logical, but at the same time, you haven't written it yet. There's nothing to introduce. So it's harder to do. It takes longer. And at the end of it, you're like, oh my gosh, that took that long. And it was one paragraph. The second reason is a lot of times you've got all these ideas rattling around your head and you just bleh all of them out into the first paragraph. And then you're not sure where to go from there. And your paragraph is confusing and so on. Or because possibly you wrote it first and you don't know where you're going with it, you're not even really on topic. Or you thought of a hilarious way to start your paper, but the paper's not hilarious. So it starts it off on a really confusing footing. So this first point is probably the most important. This idea of write the introduction after you write the paper. Write the introduction and the conclusion at the same time because they're going to go together. They bookend the paper and they mirror each other. When you write it afterwards, it's simpler, it's clearer, it's better. You are actually introducing the paper you've written because you can identify what is it I'm setting up, right? Not where do I hope this paper goes once I finish my research and so on. Where did it actually go? And then you are setting up an arc that it moves inexorably toward the conclusion. So the three parts, this is probably familiar. The three parts of an introduction, the hook, the attention getter, an overview of this specific topic, which then leads to the thesis. Now, so you move through these points because they lead naturally to each other. If your hook involves the topic, well, then it makes sense to elaborate on that hook and explain what we're talking about. And once you've done that, it makes sense to then state what is the position you are taking or what is the question you are asking about it. So what goes in it? The hook should be a sentence or two that draws us in and ultimately has us asking ourselves a question. What does that mean? How could that be? That's how you get people's interest. You make them want to know more. The most traditional ways people go about this is a meaningful quote, but these often go awry because the quote isn't actually meaningful. You just looked it up on meaningfulquotes.com or something like that. You've got an interesting analogy or metaphor through which you're going to get somebody's attention or a fact. But whatever it is, your default setting should always be that it is real world. And the reason to do that as your default is to avoid a lot of the common pitfalls of bad introductions. And again, this is not a rule. This is not a written in stone somewhere, but this is a safety net if introductions give you trouble. This grounds it in the real world, and that is always going to be more effective than purely hypothetical. What shouldn't you do? And we're all guilty of some of these, but let this be the glorious day that you do them no more. The dictionary beginning. Webster's Dictionary defines, and of course the dawn of time introduction where you're not sure where to start, so you just backtrack all the way to the beginning. Probably the most egregiously abused is the "have you ever wondered?" Because almost guaranteed the answer is no, but even if the answer is yes, my attention isn't gotten. It doesn't actually engage. And then the other one is the obviously fake scenario, right? So, when Timmy gets to class, he has a harder time paying attention because he hasn't had breakfast. There's no Timmy. I know there's no Timmy. And so now you've made an introduction that is so boring, you've made me not care about child hunger for a minute. All right, so a way to think of this in how you're starting your paper is this kind of a spectrum. A terrible hook, a terrible setup for your paper actively sabotages it. It instills in the reader dread of what's to come. This can be typos, this can be just boring, it's clearly irrelevant. Generic, this is basically the same thing as there being nothing there. Functional does in fact set up where you're going. And if you can get to functional, great. This instills a sense of, as I say there, understanding, of knowing like, okay, I get a sense of the topic, I get a sense of what it is you're trying to draw me into. But an effective one actually instills genuine curiosity and instills a trust that you are crafting something and you know where you're going. So to go back to that Timmy one, have you ever wondered what it'd be like to be hungry? Well, no, because I'm a living being and I have been hungry. Like that beginning would make me just immediately feel like, oh no, how soon can I be done with this paper? How am I going to find nice things to say about this paper? I'm one sentence in, I'm trying to figure out how to say something nice about this paper. The one I already told you is generic. Functional would be to give some statistics. That's a good opening because there is an inherent question there. How, if there's more and more effective farming methods, is hunger increasing in the US? An effective one, however, that one would be the most effective because that's something I could visualize. I can imagine a room full of 30 people. Maybe we're in class and I can look at the room and think about, statistically speaking, a substantial portion of these people cannot reliably have had food this morning. This sparks not only a visualization, but it also gets me wondering, how can this be? What can we do about it? And that is exactly the space you want your reader in when you go into a paper. This would naturally lead into, though, the overview of the subject. So here I've got a hook, and this one goes into nanotechnology, and I start with my hook talking about somebody, the government being able to monitor your whereabouts, run a talk screen, listen to your conversations without you ever even knowing, which then would lead into the overview, which in this case talks about surveillance. And in this case, the overview is probably going to be about 3 sentences. This is simply an extension of the attention getter, right? It is building off of that into what specifically are we talking about? This is where you're going to establish the parameters of where are we talking about in the world for this topic? What time period? Who is the subject? And all the limitations are going to get established here. Then it's going to lead naturally into, so what is your claim about it? What is your thesis statement? This should be a single sentence that establishes where specifically are you going with this? What is the subject? And what is the assertion? The subject is the specific thing you are analyzing. The assertion is, what is it that you need to prove about it? Now you can build off of that into what is the impact of that, etc. But those are the essential pieces. You've got to have a crystal clear sense of this is exact. So, I mean, if you're analyzing a book, are you analyzing the whole book, a character in the book, the author, a section of the book? That's your subject. The more specific, the better. And then the assertion is, what is the thing that you're bringing to this academic conversation to prove about it? Now, this is going to lead naturally into the next section on conclusions, which will be in the next video. And again, I highly recommend that you write these at the same time, ultimately when you're writing a paper.